Victor Harrison had everything that many would consider the pinnacle of success: a glittering career at a renowned New York investment firm, a luxurious apartment, and the respect of his peers. But behind this impeccable facade, there was a man tormented by the cruel words of a father who never believed him. What if the path Victor chose to prove himself was destroying him from within? What if true peace was where he least expected it? Everything changed in a single instant when a heart attack led to a near-death experience that challenged everything he believed. Floating between life and death, Victor found himself face to face with someone he never imagined he would see again. What would his father reveal in that mysterious place? And how would this experience completely transform Victor's life, making him question everything he valued? I'm Anthony Bennett, and welcome to my near-death experience channel. Let's listen to the story together. Victor Harrison was a man who had dedicated his entire life to work. At age 42, he was one of the most successful executives at a renowned investment firm in New York. His name was synonymous with efficiency and success, and he was proud of his trajectory. From a young age, Victor believed that money was the key to happiness and security. This led him to build a brilliant career where he accumulated wealth and status without ever looking back. Victor was known for his almost military discipline. Every day, he followed the same rigid routine, waking up at 5 a.m., going for a quick run, then diving into a day of work that often stretched late into the night. His colleagues admired and feared him, as he always demanded the most from himself and others. Victor prided himself on never taking a vacation, as he saw it as a sign of weakness and lack of ambition. To him, time was money, and he couldn't afford to waste it. In his personal life, Victor was distant and lonely. He did not maintain close relationships, as he believed they could distract from his goals. His parents, now deceased, were distant memories, especially his father, with whom he had a difficult relationship. Throughout his childhood, Victor was subjected to severe criticism and constant humiliation from his father. "You'll never amount to anything in life," he said. These words shaped Victor's determination to prove him wrong. The success that Victor achieved was a form of silent revenge against his father's words. Every promotion, every pay raise, was a personal victory, a reminder that he had exceeded expectations. However, behind this facade of success, there was a man who still bore the emotional scars of his past. Victor never allowed himself to process these wounds, believing that strength was the only way to move forward. The tireless search for more money and recognition became the only thing that gave Victor's life meaning. He believed that by accumulating more wealth, he could finally fill the emptiness he felt. But as the years passed, he began to realize that no matter how much he earned, the feeling of dissatisfaction persisted. Victor began to wonder if there was something wrong with him, but he quickly pushed those thoughts away, burying himself even deeper in his work. His few moments of rest were disturbed by nightmares and painful memories of his father. Even in his dreams, he could not escape the criticism and the feeling of inadequacy he had carried since childhood. He was trapped in a vicious cycle of working to escape his emotions, and those emotions, in turn, haunted him with every step he took. Victor saw himself as a machine, unable to stop, always looking for the next big goal. Deep down, Victor knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to change it. The idea of slowing down or getting help seemed impossible to him. Admitting that he was failing in some aspect of life would be admitting that his father was right, and that was something he couldn't bear. So Victor continued his relentless race to success, ignoring the signs that his body and mind were about to fall apart. Victor not only sacrificed his mental and physical health for work, but also his personal connections. He never married and avoided romantic relationships. For him, people were sources of complication and distraction. His social circle was limited to superficial interactions with coworkers and business contacts. Victor believed that human emotions were weaknesses that could divert him from his goals. His mother, who lived alone in a small town in Pennsylvania, was the only family he still had sporadic contact with. Victor visited her once a year, always at Christmas, and spent the rest of the time involved in his professional obligations. These visits were brief and impersonal, as he believed that showing any type of emotion was a sign of weakness. For Victor, the only way to show he cared was to send money, which he did regularly. Victor's childhood friends, those who shared fond memories and moments of relaxation, were left behind as he rose in his career. He thought these ties were childish and unnecessary. What mattered now were the connections that could bring professional benefits, and those were the only ones he cultivated. He attended corporate events, business dinners, and networking meetings, but never allowed himself to let his guard down. Victor isolated himself in a world where he believed financial success was the only metric of value. His weekends were solitary, spent in his luxurious apartment, where he reviewed reports and set new goals. The apartment, decorated with expensive pieces and designer furniture, was a reflection of her life, beautiful on the outside but empty on the inside. He rarely invited anyone to his home as it would interfere with his focus on work. As he grew older, Victor began to feel the effects of his loneliness. Although he would never admit it to himself, he missed a true connection, someone with whom he could share his victories and defeats. In the few moments of introspection, he wondered if he had made a mistake by pushing everyone out of his life. However, the fear of admitting weakness made him return to his vicious cycle of incessant work. Even with all the wealth he accumulated, Victor was unable to find the peace he sought. He bought expensive cars, designer clothes, and went on luxurious trips, but none of that filled the emptiness he felt. Each new acquisition gave him temporary satisfaction, but soon after he felt that feeling of incompleteness again. He was trapped in a trap of his own making, where material success was not enough to bring happiness. Victor's emotional isolation was evident to those who tried to get close to him. Coworkers and acquaintances noticed his coldness and distance, but few dared to confront him. Victor had built an image of a ruthless man, and he wasn't about to let it fall. Deep down, he feared that if anyone saw his true vulnerability, he would lose the respect and admiration he had earned so hard. As time passed, Victor's frenetic lifestyle began to take its toll. He completely ignored his health, convinced he could continue at the same pace indefinitely. He began to suffer from insomnia, waking up several times during the night with his heart racing and his mind full of thoughts about work. He believed he could overcome his fatigue with more work and caffeine, without realizing he was approaching a breakdown. The chest pain was the first physical sign that something was terribly wrong. Initially, it was a mild pain, which he attributed to stress. But, over time, the pain became more frequent and intense. Even so, Victor refused to seek medical help. He was convinced that any weakness could jeopardize his career and reputation. "I can't afford to stop now," he thought, as he ignored the warnings his body was giving him. Coworkers began to notice that something wasn't right with Victor. He seemed more tense and distracted, and his angry outbursts became more frequent. Those who tried to advise him to take time off or take care of his health were quickly dismissed. Victor believed he couldn't allow himself to slow down, as it would mean he was giving up on his dreams. The idea of failing, even if it was just in taking care of yourself, was unacceptable. In addition to his physical problems, Victor began to suffer from severe anxiety. He spent sleepless nights, worrying about the future, about his team's performance, and about the possibility of losing everything he had achieved. These thoughts tormented him to the point where he had difficulty concentrating on simple tasks. However, instead of seeking help, Victor threw himself into work even more, believing that the solution lay in increasing his productivity even further. The chest pains continued to worsen, accompanied by an increasing feeling of fatigue. Still, Victor refused to take a break. He had convinced himself that he was on the verge of a great professional achievement and that any deviation from the plan could ruin everything. The pressure he was putting on himself was unbearable, but he didn't know how to stop. Increasingly, he moved away from reality, immersed in his world of unattainable goals and objectives. Victor began to realize that something inside him was breaking. There were times when he felt a strange sense of despair, as if he were losing control of his own life. But he pushed those feelings deep inside of his mind, refusing to face the truth. He believed he could overcome anything with willpower and determination, but he was about to discover that that wasn't always enough. The day of the collapse was the culmination of years of neglect and denial. Victor was in his office, reviewing an important contract, when he felt a sharp pain in his chest, followed by a wave of weakness that made him fall out of his chair. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't respond. Panic took over him when he realized he was having a heart attack. He wanted to scream for help, but the words wouldn't come out. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was the computer screen in front of him, with numbers and graphs that suddenly seemed insignificant. Victor felt himself being pulled out of his body, as if he were floating above the scene unfolding in his office. He saw his own body lying on the floor, with his colleagues running to help him. The sight was surreal, but at the same time, there was a sense of calm that he couldn't explain. As he watched, everything around him began to fade away, and he was enveloped in total darkness. Suddenly, an intense light appeared in front of him, attracting him like a magnet. Victor didn't know what to expect, but he felt he had no choice but to follow that light. As he approached, he was overcome by a feeling of peace and tranquility that he had never experienced before. All the stress and anxiety that had dominated his life up to that point seemed to have disappeared. It was as if he was being freed from a weight he had been carrying for a long time. Stepping through the light, Victor found himself in a place that seemed familiar, but unlike anything he had ever seen. It was a lush green countryside, with gentle hills and a clear blue sky. The environment was incredibly serene, and he felt a deep connection to the place. There was no rush, no pressure, just a feeling of being at home. But he soon realized he was not alone. Walking towards him, Victor saw a figure that made his heart stop for a moment. It was her father, the man who had been such a dominant and critical presence in her life. He looked exactly as Victor remembered, tall, with an imposing posture and a serious look in his eyes. However, there was something different about his expression. Instead of hardness, there was a softness in his eyes, as if he was seeing Victor in a new way. Victor froze in place, not knowing how to react. All the emotions he had suppressed over the years came flooding back: anger, sadness, fear. He wanted to scream, wanted to accuse his father of all the things he had done, of all the cruel words that still echoed in his mind. But at the same time, there was a part of him that desperately wanted to understand, forgive, and be forgiven. The tension between these feelings left him paralyzed. His father approached, but said nothing. Instead, he simply looked at Victor, as if waiting for him to speak first. That silence was unbearable, but also full of possibilities. Victor knew this was the moment he feared and wanted at the same time. He had a chance to confront the past, to face the man who had shaped him in ways he didn't always understand. But in doing so, he would also have to confront himself. Finally, Victor found his voice. "Why didn't you ever believe me?" he asked, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. His father looked at him for a long moment before responding, his voice soft but full of meaning. "It wasn't you I didn't believe in, Victor. It was myself." These words hit Victor like a punch, and he began to see his father in a way he had never seen before, as a flawed man, full of his own insecurities and fears. His father's response left Victor shaken. He had never considered that his father's behavior might have been motivated by his own insecurities and failures. He always saw his father as an impenetrable figure, a wall of criticism and disapproval that he could never overcome. But now, before him stood a man who seemed almost vulnerable, someone who carried regrets and pain that Victor never imagined. As the two remained silent, Victor began to realize something important. All the success he had sought, all the wealth he had accumulated, was not just to prove himself to the world, but to prove to himself that he was worthy. He spent his life trying to overcome a shadow that, in truth, was not as imposing as he thought. His father, who he always considered the ultimate judge of his worth, was just a man, with flaws and regrets like any other. Victor felt a mix of emotions: anger at the lost time, sadness at the opportunities for connection that never came, and a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he saw his father as a human being, not as an implacable force of judgment. This revelation began to free him from the weight he had carried for so long. He realized that he no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even his father. His father continued to look at him, and this time, there was a tenderness in his eyes. "I wronged you, Victor," he admitted, his words simple but profound. "I wanted you to be strong, but I ended up putting a burden on you that wasn't yours to bear." These words, which Victor had been waiting to hear his entire life, hit him with an intensity he hadn't expected. He felt tears fill his eyes, but he couldn't hold them back. It was as if all the pain and resentment he had built up over the years was being released. Victor and his father were silent for a long time, just looking at each other, as if they were finally recognizing each other for the first time. That moment was one of indescribable peace, a sense of resolution that Victor never believed was possible. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he also knew he didn't need to be its prisoner anymore. He was free to move on, to live his life in a way that was authentic to him. As the light around them began to intensify, Victor felt the time to make a choice was approaching. He could feel a pull to move on, to an unknown place that seemed to promise eternal peace. But at the same time, he knew there were still things he needed to do in the life he had left behind. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had been given a new understanding, a new chance to live differently. Finally, his father took a step back, as if giving him space to make his decision. Victor knew what he needed to do. With one last look at his father, he whispered, "Thank you." Then, he turned and walked towards the light that was beginning to envelop him, feeling like he was being pulled back into the world of the living. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was sure he was ready to face whatever came. When Victor opened his eyes, he felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. He was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that monitored his vital signs. The room was silent except for the constant beeping of the heart monitor. He blinked several times, trying to understand where he was and what had happened. Little by little, the memories began to come back, the breakdown in the office, the feeling of leaving his body, and the extraordinary experience he had just had. A nurse entered the room and, realizing he was awake, smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Harrison," she said, her tone gentle. "You were very lucky. The doctors were able to stabilize you in time." Victor tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his voice cracked. The nurse quickly offered him a glass of water, which he gratefully accepted. As he drank, he wondered if everything he had experienced was real or just a dream induced by the proximity of death. Doctors came soon after, explaining that he had suffered a severe heart attack. Victor heard their words, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about his father, the conversation they had, and the feeling of peace he could still feel. It all felt so real, so different from anything he had ever experienced before. He knew that no matter how they explained it, that experience had changed his life forever. During the days that followed, as he recovered in hospital, Victor had a lot of time to reflect on what had happened. He began to reevaluate every aspect of his life, his obsession with work, his relentless pursuit of success, and the price he paid for it. He realizes you who spent years trying to fill a void that money could never fill. The encounter with his father made him see that he was pursuing something that had no real value. Victor decided that as soon as he left the hospital, his life would be different. He no longer wanted to be a slave to work, nor to live to meet the expectations of others, especially the expectations he himself created around his father's words. He wanted a life where he could be truly happy, where he could find peace and satisfaction without having to sacrifice his health or his emotions. During this time, he also realized the importance of the people around him. He had withdrawn from everyone, believing that financial success was more important than human connections. But now, he understood that he was wrong. Visits from concerned colleagues and messages from his mother, who immediately traveled to be by his side, made Victor realize how much he had neglected personal relationships. He was determined to change that. With this new perspective, Victor felt a strange sense of hope. For the first time in a long time, he was excited about the future, not because of the next big deal or promotion, but because of the possibilities for a more balanced and meaningful life. He knew that the journey to this new life would not be easy, but he was ready to face the challenges. Whatever the future brought, he would face it with a lighter heart and a clearer mind. After being released from the hospital, Victor returned to his apartment, but he no longer saw the place in the same way. Everything looked different: the pristine white walls, the expensive furniture, the sophisticated artwork. Before, these things were symbols of his success, but now they seemed empty and meaningless. He sat on his leather sofa, looking around, and felt a deep sadness for the time and energy he had spent creating a life that, in the end, did not bring him happiness. Victor decided he needed a break. For the first time in his adult life, he took an extended leave of absence from work. The company, although surprised, respected his decision, as superiors knew he had almost lost his life. During this time away from business, Victor dedicated himself to taking care of his health and understanding himself better. He began going to therapy, something he previously saw as a weakness but now considered essential to his recovery. In the following months, Victor immersed himself in a process of self-discovery. He began to explore interests and hobbies that he had ignored for years. He discovered the pleasure of cooking, something he always considered a waste of time. He started going to a park near his home to walk and reflect, something that brought him a peace he didn't know he needed. Victor also began meditating, learning the importance of being present and aware in the moment. During this time, Victor also reconnected with his mother, something he had neglected for a long time. They started talking more often, not just about trivial things, but about deeper issues, like her relationship with her father and the difficulties they faced as a family. These conversations helped Victor better understand his own past and forgive both himself and his father. He also began to repair the relationships he had neglected over the years. Victor looked for old friends, apologized, and expressed his desire to renew friendships. He knew he couldn't erase the years of distance and neglect, but he was determined to do things differently from now on. Surprisingly, many of these friends welcomed him back with open arms, happy to see that he was trying to change. Victor also re-engaged with his community. He began participating in volunteer activities, something he had never considered before. Working with people in need has given him a new perspective on life and what really matters. He discovered that helping others brought him satisfaction that money could never provide. Every little act of kindness seemed to fill the emptiness he had felt for so long. Gradually, Victor began to feel an internal transformation. He was no longer the man obsessed with success and money. Instead, I was learning to value the simple things in life: the company of friends, the tranquility of a walk in the park, the satisfaction of helping others. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He was beginning to find the peace he had always sought. As time passed, Victor began to reflect more deeply on his near-death experience and meeting his father. He knew that experience had been a turning point, a call to rethink his life. Victor began writing a diary, recording his memories and feelings about what had happened. Writing helped him process the complex emotions that were still inside him and make sense of what he had experienced. Each time he wrote, Victor revisited his father's words: "Live for yourself, not for me." These words became a mantra in his life, a constant reminder that he needed to find his own path, without being guided by the expectations of others or the shadows of the past. He began to see his former obsession with success as a form of escape, a way to avoid facing his deepest fears and insecurities. Victor also began to realize that although his father had made many mistakes, he was also a victim of his own circumstances. Throughout his life, Victor had harbored deep resentment towards his father, blaming him for his own failings and insecurities. But now, he began to see that his father was fighting too, trying the best way he knew how, even if it meant being harsh and critical. With this new understanding, Victor began to practice forgiveness. He allowed himself to forgive his father, not to absolve him of his actions, but to free himself from the weight of the past. Victor realized that by holding on to resentment, he was only perpetuating the cycle of pain and suffering. Forgiving his father was an important step in his own healing, and it helped him find a peace he had never known before. Victor also realized that he needed to forgive himself. He had made mistakes throughout his life, alienated important people, and lost himself in an empty quest for success. But now he saw that these mistakes were part of his growth. Victor began to be kinder to himself, recognizing that he was a flawed human being, but capable of change and redemption. Self-forgiveness was a slow but crucial process for his transformation. As he reflected on his journey, Victor realized that true success was not in accumulating wealth or recognition, but in living according to his own values and finding happiness in the little things. He began to redefine what it meant to be successful, focusing more on his health, his relationships, and his emotional well-being. This shift in perspective gave him a renewed sense of purpose and direction. Victor also decided to share his story with others. He began attending support groups and talking about his near-death experience and the lessons he learned. He wanted to help others who, like him, were trapped in a never-ending race for material success. His story touched many, and he discovered that by sharing his journey, he was also helping to heal himself. Over time, Victor's life began to follow a new direction. He returned to work, but not in the same way as before. Victor decided he no longer wanted to be the ruthless executive who sacrificed everything in the name of success. He negotiated a position with less responsibility that would allow him to balance his professional life with his new personal priorities. This decision surprised many, but Victor knew it was what he needed to do. He began using his free time to pursue activities that brought him joy and fulfillment. Victor signed up for a cooking course, something he always wanted to do but never had the time. He also began painting, discovering a passion for art that he had never explored before. These creative pursuits became a source of joy and expression for him, something that contrasted sharply with the rigidity of his previous life. Victor also continued to engage in volunteer work, helping at shelters and participating in community programs. He discovered that giving of himself, without expecting anything in return, brought him deep satisfaction. Helping others became a way to give meaning to your life and reconnect with your humanity. He began to realize that true wealth was not in what he owned, but in the relationships and experiences he cultivated. Victor's personal relationships also flourished. He rebuilt ties with old friends and began cultivating new friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect. Victor allowed himself to be more vulnerable, to show his true self without fear of judgment. He discovered that by opening his heart, he was creating deeper, more meaningful connections with the people around him. Victor's relationship with his mother also improved significantly. They began to see each other more frequently, and Victor opened up about his struggles and accomplishments. He discovered that his mother, despite her own challenges, was always there for him, even when he was far away. These conversations brought a new intimacy and understanding between the two, and Victor felt grateful to be able to share this phase of his life with her. Although Victor still faced challenges, he was now better equipped to deal with them. He learned the importance of taking care of himself, both physically and emotionally. He developed a regular meditation practice and continued to attend therapy, recognizing that mental health is as important as any other aspect of his life. Victor did not want to return to old patterns of behavior and was committed to maintaining the changes he had made. As he followed this new path, Victor felt like he was finally living an authentic life. He was no longer a prisoner of the expectations of success that had governed his life for so long. Instead, he was creating a life that reflected who he really was, with all its complexities and imperfections. He was at peace with the past and eager to see what the future held. Victor's near-death experience changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. He went from a man obsessed with success and money to someone who values simplicity, human connections, and inner peace. This transformation was not easy, but it was deeply necessary. Victor realized that life is short and that he didn't want to spend his days chasing something that ultimately didn't bring him happiness. Victor began sharing his story with others, both in small support groups and in larger talks. He wanted to show that even those who seem to have everything can be deeply dissatisfied inside. His message was clear. True success is not measured by your bank balance or your job title, but by the state of your heart and the quality of your relationships. He has also become an advocate for mental health, especially in the corporate world where so many people live under constant stress and pressure. Victor knew from experience how dangerous it can be to ignore the signs of burnout. He began working with companies to create healthier work environments and support employee wellness initiatives. He wanted to help others avoid the destructive path he had taken. Victor also wrote a book about his experience, in which he shared the lessons he learned and how they changed his life. The book was well received and became a source of inspiration for many. People connected with her story of overcoming and transformation, seeing in her an example that it is possible to change, no matter how far you have gone down the wrong path. Looking back, Victor saw his near-death experience as a gift. She forced him to stop and reevaluate everything in his life. Without this traumatic event, he might have continued his relentless run, perhaps even destroying his health and life in the process. Instead, he was given a second chance, an opportunity to live more consciously, with more love and compassion. Victor now lives a life he would never have imagined for himself a few years earlier. He still works, but at a pace that allows him time for the things that really matter. He has close friends, a strong relationship with his mother, and is involved in activities that bring him joy and purpose. More than that, he found the inner peace he sought so much, and which, in the end, was not in external achievements, but in a much deeper place. Victor knew his journey of self-discovery was not complete, and perhaps never would be. But that didn't bother him. He had learned to value the path as much as the destination. And as he continued to grow and evolve, he knew he was living life the way he always should have lived it, not to prove something to anyone, but to be true to himself and what really mattered.